Okay, so upon its publication in 2015, Capitalism and the Web of Life reconceptualized capitalism as a world ecology of power, profit, and life, sparking widespread conversations and critiques on the academic left. In this fourth session seminar, we revisit the book to elaborate three conceptual innovations that have been built upon this historical and theoretical architecture over the past decade, foregrounding the labor theory of life. First, Marx and Engels' historical materialism departs from a critique of abstract man and abstract nature, centering instead on the labor process as the pivotal relation that simultaneously unfolds between humans and with the rest of nature. Such a labor-metabolic approach, labor created man, Engels lays the groundwork for conceptualization of a class struggle in the web of life, an irreducibly socio-metabolic contradiction. Second, the critique of man and nature dualism is fundamentally a critique of ideology, underscoring its central role in imperialism through the Civilizing Projects from Columbus to the Washington Consensus. This ideological framework has enabled the capricious and epoch-making extra-economic appropriation and economic exploitation that underwrites endless accumulation. Third, the origins of the climate crisis are rooted in the worldwide class formation that began in 1492 during Marx's era of so-called primitive accumulation. This historical account traces how early capitalist enclosures and expropriations initiated planetary-scale ecological disruption, forcing fresh connections with contemporary class struggles and amid escalating climate crisis, and opening avenues for revolutionary strategies. Jason Moore is a professor of sociology at Binghamton University and coordinator of the World Ecology Research Network. He is the author of Capitalism and the Web of Life, 2015, and his interviews and lectures can be found on his website, jasonwmoore.com. Jason, I hand over to you.
Thanks so much. What a treat to be here. So let me begin by saying that I view this as a conversation and that this process works best if we are all diving in and asking questions, simple questions, complex, political, theoretical, so long as we are grounding ourselves, as Marx and Engels would say, in the real ground of history and also in the text that we're looking at. Obviously, for today, this is very heavy on Marx and Engels. And we can explore this, we can approach this however we want. We have a small group here. I think we have 12 students, which is a very good size. And I thought what I would do is to proceed with a few introductory remarks. And from there, we can dive into the discussion. And I can give other mini lectures, like small lectures, miniature lectures, as we proceed. But really, the best approach is a conversational one where we have a dialogue-centered pedagogy. My intention here is, as I've said for many, many years, to cultivate a conversation that will be grounded in these classical positions of historical materialism, although inadequately recognized by Marxists and non-Marxists alike. Does that sound like a good plan? A short introduction, and then we can dive in? Yes? At that time, I'll just ask you to, after about 10 minutes, I'll ask you to turn on your microphones and to turn on your videos if that's possible, so we can at least have the virtual feel of being in a seminar room and engaging in conversation. All right, so what we have set before you in terms of the text for the first session, and I realize some of you have maybe different degrees of familiarity with these and distinctive opportunities to read them. And that doesn't matter. You can ask the questions as they go. Of course, I have an impossible task to lay out a few threads for discussion based on the foundations of historical materialism. And as you'll see, at least two major, not reconceptualizations, but rereadings and reappreciations of Marx and Engels' classical formulations around capitalism as a world ecology of power, profit, and life, as a class society, as a mode of production, always operating with and within webs of life. Those I narrow, one is from Wittfogel, who was later known as a kind of post-Marxist cold warrior, although he never saw himself as post-Marxist. In his early classical formulation, not published in English until 1985, we see a recuperation of what would later be called ecological Marxism or eco-socialism, long before anyone paid attention. And as it turns out, eco-Marxists and eco-socialists don't pay any attention to what Wittfogel wrote. So I encourage you to dig into Wittfogel's three-part essay that he published in German and Russian in 1929, and then my new preface to the 10th anniversary edition of Capitalism and the Web of Life, where I walk through the elements of a labor theory of life. With that in mind, let me try to walk through a few crucial elements and perhaps raise some provocations for conversation. First, the labor theory of life. This is clearly what Marx and Engels are developing in these texts, a labor-metabolic class struggle approach to the web of life. This includes, as I articulate in my Nature and Other Dangerous Words, a mix of dialectical and non-dialectical antagonisms. It is plainly fairly problematic and probably very, very inaccurate to describe, for instance, volcanic eruptions as dialectics. However, volcanic eruptions, solar cycles, orbital variations of planet Earth do indeed shape the world's climate, and class societies are fundamentally influenced by climate conditions, above all because the conditions for surplus labor are, broadly speaking, established by climate conditions. Obviously, a mode of production in Greenland is going to have very different conditions of labor and possibilities of class formation than one in southern China or the Midwestern United States. While Marx and Engels are routinely addressed as theorists, as they make clear in these fundamental 30 pages or so of the German ideology, part one of the German ideology, they insist that all theoretical differences be resolved on, as they say, the real ground of history. This, too, is often lost in Marxist as well as non-Marxist circles. The insistence that we ground the approach to theory construction on praxis. Of course, praxis has two great moments. One is the reevaluation of theory in light of contemporary, ongoing events and practice. And then, of course, also through retrodiction and the analysis of real, concrete historical change. One of the interesting things about the German ideology, and really if you had to select just one text from today's sessions, what I would recommend is to focus on part one of the German ideology. What you have here from the opening pages is a call for a single science, or what Marx calls in the manuscripts of 1844, a one science, a proletarian science. In the German ideology, they call for a single science, the science of history, because, of course, everything is historical, whether it's 5 minutes ago, 5 centuries, 5 millennia, you get the idea. And what they are walking through in the German ideology is a series of propositions about labor, the emergence of class society, the conceptualization of production, which when you get into it, if you haven't already, you will see, for instance, that production includes also, as they say, the social reproduction, the creation of the production of fresh life in procreation, that it puts together as Wally Seacombe summarizes the dynamics of daily production with intergenerational reproduction. They insist that capitalism is, above all, a world historical phenomenon, that the class struggle is world historical, that the accumulation of capital is world historical. Themes later taken up, of course, in the manifesto, in Capital, and many other texts. And that production is fundamentally socio-ecological. This again is underscored in these snippets of capital that we get on the labor process. The labor process is fundamentally a metabolic dynamic between humans and, as they repeatedly say, the rest of nature, the rest of life, external nature, that the labor process puts together, as I've been suggesting, both dialectical and non-dialectical moments. For instance, soil weathering is not necessarily dialectical, although in the era of capitalogenic climate change, that is changing. And then finally, what Marx and Engels are doing in the German ideology is insisting on not just production as a complex, a rich totality of many determinations, as Marx would say in the Grundrisse, of production and reproduction, but also of the material and mental means of production. It always gives me a bit of a chuckle when Marxists think that the phrase means of mental production, oh, that's interesting, I've never heard of that. Well, it turns out Marx and Engels are beginning their critique of ideology, their sociology of knowledge, or class critique of ideology as situated within the evolving social, geographical, and technical divisions of labor. That is, that capitalism tends to produce its own group or stratum of conceptive ideologists who produce the ruling ideas of every era. Of course, today, mostly the bourgeoisie farms that out to established and reputable academics. These are all part of this great sort of world historical movement of ideas, of material life, of class struggle, which includes all of these moments. And it's worth underlining, because it's been butchered again, both by Marxists and non-Marxists, that Marx and Engels' conception of the class struggle is an ontological premise for everything else. It's not that there's a class struggle over here and the formation of states over there and the accumulation of capital somewhere else. These are all dialectically interrelated moments of the class struggle, and these are mediations of the worldwide class struggle in the web of life. I think no place is this more clear than in what I suggested we look at in Marx's general law of capital accumulation, where we understand that accumulation, the accumulation of wealth at one end and misery at another, is itself a socio-ecological dynamic that is always, from the standpoint of the bourgeoisie, justified in terms of nature or natural law. This, of course, was Malthus's intervention early on to insist that poverty was the outcome of natural law, which in his case was population, but could take very, very distinctive forms, for instance, eugenics in the late 19th century. The snippet from Capital on the soil and the worker is often misunderstood. It's not the soil in one place and the worker in another. It is the point that under large-scale industry, capital systematically combines the work of soils and the work of human natures in distinctive class historical combinations. This gives us a very, very different politics of for instance, climate crisis, that instead of trying to save nature or something like that, we understand that the climate crisis is itself driven by the class struggle on the web of life in its specific concrete historical forms under capitalism, something I've shorthanded as capitalogenic. So that makes a world of difference to one's environmental politics. If you're an activist in foundation-funded climate justice, then you might want to do something like just stop oil. Whereas if you are a communist in Marx and Engels sense, then you look at the fundamental relations of class power under capitalism and the ways in which climate change, capitalogenic climate change, impacts the conditions of surplus labor and thence the valorization of capital. And then finally, that it bears emphasizing that a labor theory of life is not a labor reductionism, which of course would be anti-dialectical. It understands, as I've been trying to sort of weave together in this conversation and many others lately, that the point of departure for a proletarian science, a one science, a single science is the labor process, and the labor process brings together questions of material life, of consciousness, which is itself material, and of class relations at every turn. It brings together dialectical and non-dialectical antagonisms, as I underline in Nature and Other Dangerous Words. This gives us a class struggle approach to the question of alienation. And so I gave you a bare 4 or 5 pages from Marx's 1844 manuscripts, where we begin to see what's really at stake, at least we begin to see in conversation with these other texts, Marx's famous fourfold alienation from oneself, from others, from the means of production, and from webs of life. That famous passage that nature is man's inorganic body is at every point, and this bears emphasis as well, not abstract man, not abstract nature, the bourgeois categories of man and nature, but rather the proletarian Marxist historical conception of historical man and historical nature, terms that arise repeatedly throughout Marx and Engels' early formulations, and which provides the basis for everything that came after it. He's not seeing man and nature colliding with each other, as in famous limits to growth and other systems dynamics, Anthropocene presentations, with humans overwhelming the great forces of nature and that sort of thing. Rather, they are understanding that the question of the web of life is fundamentally, has to be fundamentally understood from the vantage point of labor as a socio-ecological metabolism, in which the labor and the class structures that reshape it don't determine natural conditions, but are shaped by natural conditions at the same time as they co-produce socio-ecological transformations. Obviously, in class agriculture, soils erode, soils exhaust rather. There's all sorts of landscape transformation that ensue, something that Marx and Engels underline again in those first opening pages of the German ideology, that, of course, to write the whole history of class society would be to go and put together both conditions like climate change, which in their era was not capitalogenic, but rather a non-dialectical antagonism with, as they say, the subsequent modification of landscapes through labor, that is, through specific labor processes, through specific concrete modes of production. All of this opens up big questions for making sense of so-called environmental politics today, of socialist politics, of wider and wider intellectual tendencies over the past century that are intimately connected, because at the bottom line, bourgeois power rests upon justifications of its eternal natural rule, phrases that recur from Marx across his life, and especially in Capital, that the bourgeoisie, whenever threatened, returns to nature and natural law. Malthus is the classic example of this, but was not the first and was certainly not the last. Modern environmentalism, modern climate politics has served this function for Capital for a long time, that the world's going to end, and therefore a series of inequalities must be maintained in order to resolve problems ordained or issued by so-called natural law. This comes up very often. All right, I think I've gone far enough, long enough, and I am happy to hear any question. There's no question that's too simple. No question that's too complex, although we might reel it back to the text at hand. And I just want to open it for your thoughts and debates. And you can jump in, or however, we have a small enough group. I think that you're more than welcome to just jump in.
I would like to ask a question, Jason.
Perfect. Who is that? Oh, Nick. Wonderful. Just say your name first. I can read it, but sometimes it takes me a while on the screen. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Yeah, I just want to. I think it is somewhat basic, but I'd like you to spend some time talking through this, or more time. What is at stake in saying, one has to kind of grasp the totality of labor and the web of life as a composition of both dialectical processes and non-dialectical processes. Is it just to say that there are certain laws of nature that kind of impose themselves upon us that do not act by negation, or by a certain logic that you find in labor and social life, let's say? And then I guess because I haven't read Engels's, I think the text we're going to read for next week, but I'm curious, is this what Engels tried to do with extending dialectical materialism to kind of the whole of nature?
It's a fantastic question. I think there are two or three things going on. So first, whenever I think of questions like this, and by the way, if I don't answer adequately, just come back. I think that what we want to do is, in the first instance, is look at the concrete historical problem we are trying to explain. And this really keeps us grounded and follows Marx's method. So Marx's method is to begin with concrete historical questions. And we can see this throughout his life, but especially in Capital, that Capital famously concludes with the discussion of the origins of capitalism and its subsequent development across the past across the subsequent, from the origins of capitalism, subsequent 4 centuries. Pardon me. They do a version of this, though very abstract, in the German ideology. Whether Engels did this or not, and different folks, Marxologists, will argue over this. It doesn't matter to me. More interesting is what he does in one of the Engels text for this week, that maybe some of you are familiar with, the role of labor played in the transition from ape to man. That's an outstanding example of a mix of dialectical and non-dialectical antagonisms, that the labor process itself is a driver of evolutionary change, but not in a narrow and reductionist sense, because obviously the conditions, the geographical specificity, the geographical conditions of specific webs of life vary considerably. And there's often been a failure of imagination on the eco-socialist left around this, because clearly from Engels' premise of labor created man, again in a dialectical sense, not a linear reductionist sense, it follows that modes of production are subject to the same broad dynamics. That is, there are and I think this might get to the heart of your question, Nick, and if it doesn't, bounce back at me. There are clearly dynamics of co-production between human life, human social organization, and the rest of nature that can be compellingly studied in a dialectical fashion. That is, you have in the classic instance of class societies, you have asymmetries of class power. You have historical transformation that move through those asymmetries, and then at the end of a given historical epoch, you have a new synthesis. It might look like the old synthesis, or it might look different. And as we know, Marx and Engels hoped for different, that the asymmetry of capital and labor from the 15th and 16th century ultimately yields to proletarian power and thence to the capacity for socialist transformation. The expropriators are expropriated and all of that. That's overdetermined by the best example of this is a history of climate change, which, by the way, sometimes was connected to the dynamics of class society, most notably in the long 16th century, and then during the protracted phase of the origins of agriculture, when carbonization, atmospheric carbonization was stabilized. But for the most part, climate changes were not driven by capitalogenic forcing as they are today. So that's something that historical materialists have to reckon with. And I think even those who don't agree with historical materialism need to reckon that we have to have a sense of what I'm calling dialectical and non-dialectical causation. It just doesn't make sense to me, and I'm open to being persuaded otherwise, to see solar cycles, for instance, as dialectical events, or volcanic eruptions as dialectical events. I don't think plate tectonics are dialectical events. They're definitely mechanical, and they are definitely coming into play in the case of solar cycles and volcanic activities. You can't explain the history of class society without those. And this is something because the dominant eco-Marxist imaginary is ahistorical. They don't want to be troubled with. But we need to be troubled by it, because a historical materialism that can't explain this mix of non-dialectical forces and dialectical changes can't make sense of an adequate socialist politics, because it can't make sense of historical change. Remember, praxis has these two moments of the present, itself a world historical moment, and the past, which is never past. Did I evade or get to some of what you were driving at, Nick?
No, I think that was very good. Thanks. I'm gonna sit on it for a while. Yeah.
And by the way, if I go on too long and somebody gets impatient, you want to jump in, that's fine. I think that just like in real conversation, sometimes we'll be like, okay, wait, but I don't understand this. All right, well, that was a fantastic kickoff. So I would love to hear other people's thoughts.
Maybe would you indulge me, a
Hey,
programmer?
yes, of course. Great to see you, Conrad.
Thanks. So I've been kind of scrambling here organizationally a little bit, and just trying to keep track of everything going on. But I understand what you're saying. If I understood you properly, you were saying that pure that there's the dialectic, as you understand, is incumbent on labor. Is that correct?
That's a moment of I'm a little you hear me hemming and hawing, because for me, I think dialectics are a method.
Yeah.
And it's true that I think that with labor mixed with the earth, as Raymond Williams would say, very much riffing off Marx, then you begin to see processes that resemble dialectical what dialectics' method does. So that might seem a bit fine grained, but I'm very wary about imputing dialectics to any part of the universe, which I think is tricky. Yeah.
I guess what's interesting about it to me is it seems that, there's a hybridity in your kind of methodology.
I would never
Because,
use that term.
oh, yes, of course, we can't say, yeah.
This sounds very
But,
nitpicky, but hybridity the term comes in the modern use, comes out of the capitalist agricultural revolution in the United States that we call the Green Revolution in the 1930s. And then of course, people like Latour, the
oh, but yeah,
execrable
to be clear,
Latour
I was
paper.
making no reference to that. I just meant
Yeah,
in the most
yeah.
generic. Yeah, I know. I actually, it occurred to me after I said it that, oh, this could be. But
Please, I
what I
promise
meant,
I won't interrupt. I promise. Please, I'm sorry.
no,
Please, please.
I should be worried about interrupting you. But what I meant is that no, there's a convergence of different elements to the method, because I guess on one hand, um, because in a sense, what Engels does is that he, repurposes Hegel's logic, right? Which is not a mere phenomenology, right? But a kind of higher order set of abstractions as something which is immanent to the natural world or within the natural world, right? And that's how we can get the idea of this, dialectic within nature, right? And you already have something of it in Hegel in the Second Encyclopedia on Nature, but it's a more thoroughly naturalized version of that we find within Engels. Um, and then, of course, you have Lukács, who sort of dispenses with this, right? And that's where we get maybe what we call Western Marxism in terms of there being a more maybe anthropocentric conception. And it's interesting to me with what you're saying, and of course, labor being a really crucial category for Lukács as well, because Western Marxism would often go in the direction of a kind of only conceiving of nature negatively, so as anti-practice for Jean-Paul Sartre in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, for example. So it seems to me in a way what we can see with what you're doing is this is when I say convergence of different elements, because on one hand, you're characterizing, I think, nature in a way that's ontologically positive, right? And I mean, of course, we could get into what nature means for you and nature society being linked to the law of value and all that. But I mean, there's a positivity to your methodology. But at the same time, you want to stay with this idea of the centrality of labor, or the idea that we're not just talking about nature in isolation from those processes. So I think it's interesting because it seems to me that we can kind of see a sort of convergence of aspects of maybe Engels, or I guess sometimes what they call dialectical materialism, with certain Western Marxist aspect as well. I don't know if you've thought of it that way. That's just my question. Yeah.
I think those are fantastic points. I would say this about nature, that Marx is very clear on this. In fact, he launches the critique of historical materialism. I think all of what I'm going to say is complementary to what you're
Hmm.
reflecting on, and is so important. But Marx especially launches the critique that becomes historical materialism through the critique of what he calls abstract man and abstract nature. And Marx is, of course, this is a philosophical critique, but it's not limited. It far exceeds philosophical critique. This is an ideological critique.
Hmm.
It grows out of the manuscripts, the sixth thesis on Feuerbach. Everybody pays attention to the 11th, but let's not forget the sixth thesis, which is the critique of bourgeois human nature, that Feuerbach
Hmm.
only speaks of abstract man.
Hmm.
Now,
Hmm.
why is that not just a philosophical critique? It's because it's a critique of Malthus.
Hmm.
And so what are we dealing with when we deal with Malthus? This has to be much more than an intellectual critique. Malthus is one of those conceptive ideologists that Marx and Engels talk about in the German ideology. And abstract man and abstract nature, Marx's words, become what Marx and Engels call, again, in the German ideology. You'll get tired of me repeating the German ideology again and again here. Uh, Abstract man and abstract nature are ruling ideas. And this is a theme, as you know, Conrad, that I have carried forth in conversation with Song Redl and others. These are man, nature, the kind of fundamental binary code of bourgeois
Mhm.
ideology.
Mhm.
In fact, from the very, very beginning of capitalism, long before Malthus, Descartes comes in at a specific moment. But even before Descartes, as my brilliant student Jeremy Santora has published in a brilliant essay in the Journal of World Systems Research, about this also extends to the metaphysical instrumentalists of people like Vittoria in 16th century Spain. Ultimately, that debate culminates in the famous Las Casas Sepulveda debate. These are successive moments of formation in which man and nature appear as the mediation in thought or the expression in thought of the real historical divorce of the producers from the means of production. So what does this mean in terms of Lukács, etc.? Well, I think Lukács is writing at a specific moment in which these questions, I mean, especially if you look at the post World War One moment of revolutionary optimism, and you know this better than I do, but these were very different concerns. On the other hand, Wittfogel, who's almost totally ignored by everyone, and was a member of the Frankfurt School, has a very different approach. And so then the historical question becomes, why did we pay attention to Lukács and then Sartre and not to Wittfogel? So it becomes worth consideration. Nicholas,
Thank you.
did I say your name? If I butcher your name, just
No, it's
just
okay. Okay,
work on me
I
repeatedly.
answer to Nico, Nicholas, whatever. It's fine for me.
Nicholas, all right.
Yeah, so I wanted to go back a little bit to the distinction you made between a kind of mechanistic understanding of the world, I guess, and also dialectical one. I kind of want to build on what Conrad said. I was wondering because as you were speaking, I think Conrad's comment on the kind of the tradition of Western Marxism to forget nature or kind of have an opposition to nature could actually be said not to be present so much in the Eastern tradition of Marxism. And I was kind of thinking of Alexander Bogdanov here and his sort of technology method. I don't remember how it's called. But I vividly remember when I was kind of researching on it, this emphasis on a biological understanding of nature and human experience or human activity, which perhaps could be opposed both to the mechanical and to the dialectical, or at least could be between them, in the sense of if this is the binary. So I'm wondering if, that's an interesting conversation we can have.
Absolutely. And I mean, we all know Vernadsky and the concept of the biosphere, but hardly anyone actually reads Vernadsky. Vernadsky frames this in terms of labor and, in my, of course, interpretation, a mix of dialectical and non-dialectical antagonisms. So mechanism as worldview and clearly mechanical processes like plate tectonics, for instance, I would separate that. The dialectician will, of course, recognize that, say, volcanic activity, and you can't understand the history of class society without the history of volcanism. By the way, a dialectician, a historical materialist, will clearly understand that volcanic activity is a mechanical process, and we can fine tune the phrasing here, but volcanoes don't erupt because of the class struggle. Volcanoes erupt whether the mode of production is feudalism, capitalism, socialism, or something else. I would say absolutely, Nicholas, that the efflorescence of Soviet-inspired, Soviet-led, Soviet-incubated scientific thinking is tremendously worth considering and should indeed be counterposed to the dominant threads of Western Marxism. And that's worthwhile. I would say that what eco-socialism, which in some ways righteously hates Western Marxism, in some ways not, but what eco-socialism and the main tendencies of Western Marxism share is a flight from history. And I would like to. This is kind of weird in the history of historical materialism. That history is one in which the theoretical struggle, to borrow Lenin's term, is resolved not only through the analysis of contemporary contradictions, but also on the real ground of history. That's what I would continue to reel us back to. That's why. So when we look at the history of mechanism in bourgeois thought, which is of course gigantic, that is directly and immediately and palpably related to the sort of state-led, imperialist-led class dynamics of environmental change, which are also the dynamics of class formation on a world scale. So my point about Descartes all along isn't simply that he's mechanical. It's that Descartes, in a nutshell, gives us the origins of bourgeois managerialism, which is then applied simultaneously to the management of labor, the management of the web of life, and the management of war. Those three moments, of course, dialectically bound to each other. So that the history of mechanical thought appears very different. I think that's maybe why you see somebody like Bogdanov experimenting. I don't know if it's a third way or not. Maybe it is. I'd love to hear more. But we would expect from great socialist revolutions a new mode of thought emerging, or at least the elements of a new mode of thought. Of course, in the case of the Soviet Union and many others, constrained by imperialist war and the imperative to develop the productive forces in order, to avoid total annihilation.
Thank you. I'll look up some details and I'll follow this question in the next sessions.
I mean, I like Bogdanov quite a bit. I don't like Mackenzie Wark's book on that, which I think is kind of Bogdanov without class struggle. So that would be, and I don't mean class struggle as kind of some posturing. I mean, this is the great insight of one of the great insights of many, to be sure, of Marx and Engels, that the labor process is fundamentally one of human and extra-human nature, and and that's a labor process. It's not a collision of essences. It's a labor process, and if it's a labor process, then in the history of class society, it's a class struggle. Even when it doesn't go in the direction we want it to. Fantastic. These are fantastic interventions. And again, Hugh.
Hi, good morning, or good afternoon, I suppose. How are you?
It's all good. Yeah, I'm doing well. Good to meet you.
Yeah. I'm gonna nice to meet you as well. I'm gonna try. I've been trying to thread this together since something you said early in your initial lecture kind of prompted me on a path. It's not fully resolved, but since there's a break in the conversation, I'm gonna try and go with it anyway.
Awesome.
You mentioned the kind of question of locality as it relates to a kind of weather phenomenon as a kind of undergirding principle for the way that we could define labor in a very specific and sort of like regional context, which was something that, of course, like after you said it, seems completely obvious and like it should have been considered, but it brought me to think through some reading I've been doing on Yokyui's cosmotechnics and the way that like there's a kind of Western tendency to apply a kind of blanket phenomenon to technology from a very, again, like Western centric, he's coming from Fennel, I think, basically, but to kind of apply this sort of blanket definition of how technology kind of relates to all specific regions from a very Western centric perspective. And you by kind of prompting this idea of locality and its specific relation to the unfolding and definition of labor, then also kind of brought me back to something which stayed with me from the first time I read your book, which is now, almost 10 years ago, but where you're speaking about the introduction of scale. I think I still remember the quote vividly at the end of the barrel of a gun, and how these very specific kind of like regional economies were structured around sort of barter or good specific arbitrages. Anyway, I guess what I'm trying to get to is that you're threading together the kind of necessity for the investigation of these very specific ecological locales that kind of fight scale. But one thing that has always sort of impressed itself upon me when we're thinking through Marxism is it's kind of like totalizing telos, right? Like that it applies, at least in my experience with it, which is I'm by no means a Marx expert. Recently someone made the joke that like if you ask 10,000 Marxists their opinion on Marx, you'll find one person who's actually read it, which I think is probably actually, I've read more
There's
than
some
that,
truth
but
there.
like, yeah, I think there's some truth to that. Anyway, I'm sort of off on a vector. I was wondering if you could just sort of expand on that first point because it came early on in what you were saying and it struck something with me that I think is interesting to think about through locality, scale, regionality, this kind of like totalizing telos, and maybe the potential for kind of like gradients or splinters within this kind of operating principle of Marxism. I mean, you used the word Western Marxism in your last answer, which I think is starting to point to this idea that there is a gradient within that spectrum. But anyway, I'm gonna kind of I think there's enough in there to prompt something. Sorry that it's only a half-baked question.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic, and I'll probably only be able to touch on a moment or two of it, so you can push me in more in that direction as you want. Well, I would say first of all, obviously Marxism, like every other ideological current and political current, is impacted by bourgeois ideology. So hence tendencies towards a bourgeois and abstract totalization. And invariably occur, and not just in Marxism, in all fields of, let's call it broadly, critical inquiry, including the sort of hyper ideographic approach of post-structuralism during the neoliberal counter-revolution. The endless search for particularity is itself a form of totalization. And but yes, absolutely. And this was what you underline about the capitalist fantasy that all of the web of life can be reduced to interchangeable parts, and therefore that capitalist forces can control or quiet or sand down all of those local particularities. That's something very much at the heart of successive agricultural revolutions, for one, but also many other features of the capitalist world ecology over the past 5 centuries. No serious Marxist, that is the one in, I would say maybe 5 or 6 out of 100 who have taken seriously Marx and then taken seriously what Marx believed in most, which is history, and the history as a history of class struggle and the web of life. I would say that in that sense, Marxism is always, historical materialism as method is always about looking at the concrete and the historical, which can take many different forms. The point of view of totality, of course, is not a theory of everything. It is exactly as we would expect from that phrase, the point of view. It's a standpoint to reconstruct the relevant totalities under consideration. Under capitalism, that necessarily requires us as revolutionaries to construct capitalism in its world historical totality, which is not like this layer above everything that then mechanically determines everything else. But in other class societies, they have very different world historical characteristics. Obviously, Song China influences Eurasian history in all sorts of profound ways, but does not become a global system. And that's one of my favorite examples. If you look at the invention, if that's the right term, the invention of wet rice multi-cropping in kind of high medieval Song China, you see a very, very different set of environmental possibilities than you do, say, in the grain dry farming, livestock grain complex of France at the same time. They have very, very different potentials for surplus labor. Pardon me. And that matters quite a bit. So surplus labor is at once generic and specific. This is what's great in Marxist thinking. So he says, well, here's surplus labor, many different societies have surplus labor. They operate according to very, very distinctive logics that are certainly not determined, but that emerge within definite environmental conditions. That's threading together a lot of this. But no doubt, I mean, there are plenty of Marxists who treat Marxism as a recipe book. And just like there are plenty of Weberians, plenty of you name it. I mean, intellectuals generally are kind of intellectually lazy. Of course, most rank and file academics want a recipe book, whether that's pardon me, whether that's a Marxist version, whatever that is, or a Weberian version, or a post-structuralist version.
I think that was a fantastic answer. I loved this line, generic and specific, as a way of describing surplus labor. It's something that I hadn't really kind of applied as a term to that before. I think that's great. And this idea that it can be like self-concretizing by specific region and sort of come up with its own definition as it kind of, for lack of a better word, valorizes itself, is really kind of interesting. So I'm going to chew on that. Thank you very much for your comments.
That's good. And we can, in whatever circumstance, we can always carry that back into the specific, so long as we don't reify the specific in a bourgeois way, right? So in bourgeois thought, you have a series of nomothetic propositions that are, and then we find examples for them. Whereas in Marxism, the specific instances of any concrete historical formation reveal themselves as expressive and then lead us as investigators to reconceptualize the totality, the concrete historical totality. So when I dove into capitalism and I said, look, there's clearly a dynamic. I mean, intuitively, I saw this 25 years ago when I studied plantation slavery. There's clearly a concrete historical labor dynamic that leads to the transformation of the mode of production. And that's very concrete. If you want to understand, well, where did the capital come from for the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? It came from the plantations and the slave trade. I mean, that's not a matter of speculation. That's just
it's fact,
a fact
yeah.
of the matter.
Yeah.
And you can see that once you start to dive in. Whereas in bourgeois thought, and many Marxists are basically bourgeois thinkers, they have their sort of meta categories and then they just apply them.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thanks. All right, these are great questions. Vera.
Oh,
Yeah,
hi.
Vera.
Nice to meet you. Hi, everyone.
Great to meet you. Yes.
Well, I don't have like this information very fresh in my mind. I like 10 years ago or something, I had a seminar on dependency theory, Latin American dependency theory. And now with Hugh's question and your response, I just remembered like how maybe it has something to do with it. As I say, I don't have it very fresh in my mind. How another way of thinking totality, where dependency theorists criticize this idea of totality as an endeavor where agents can be interchangeable, and instead of that, to think about totality as an integration model. So saying the periphery is in the center, is integrated to the center, and if we think about these elements as interchangeable, then we cannot describe how is it that these territories are fully integrated into the world economic system without these developmentalist theories to be useful for politics in those areas. I don't know if maybe it has.
Oh, please continue.
Oh, that was it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's important. So dependency theory in the uppercase emerges specifically as a Latin American critique of Truman's point four developmentalism. Truman gives his inauguration speech in 1949, and the fourth point is basically declaring 80% of the planet undeveloped. That was a reinvention of the older civilized, uncivilized binary that we'll encounter. And it was, yes, so in that sense, it was very useful in the sense that you, I think, very, very effectively underlined and articulated, very effective, a critique of American developmentalism, which was the sort of human face, if you will, of American imperialism after World War II. Dependency theory faltered in the sense that it was as a political project, it was fundamentally a bourgeois nationalist project. And the great contribution of people like Wallerstein from the early 70s forward was to render, for a moment, for about a decade, a class critique of dependency theory, that where dependency theory posited the exploitation of countries by other countries. The Wallerstein model was a class struggle model, a class critique model. So in what's often been forgotten, that Wallerstein's account of core and periphery was one of the flows of surplus value, and also of world class formation, of bourgeoisification on the one hand and proletarianization on the other. Again, I'm not really a Wallersteinian in the sense that people understand that, but I'm a Marxist in the sense that it was world historical and it was a class dynamic. And exactly. So the Marxist critique is always, as you, I think, masterfully laid out, a critique of these big abstract universalist models. And on closer inspection, almost all of those big abstract universal models, very few people want to talk about this. Those bourgeois models, including especially economic models, are grounded in bourgeois naturalism. And I mean that in a very specific way, not just going back to Malthus and Ricardo in other ways, but also somebody like Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, former president of Harvard. He goes to the International Monetary Fund meeting in Bangkok in 1991. And he says, the laws of economics are like the laws of engineering. One set works everywhere. And that's the power of bourgeois naturalism, which has its neoliberal face, or one of its neoliberal faces was, of course, neoclassical economics. The other face of that was mainstream environmentalism and the systems dynamics thinking. They come out of they both come out of American empire in very, very concrete ways. All right, these are fun.
I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Can
please.
you repeat that? One of its neoliberal faces was
So
neoclassical economics, and the other
is environmentalism.
Thank you.
Do you mind repeating the
Environmentalism
Larry Summers quote again as well, please?
Oh,
That was great.
You'll encounter it in I think I found it first with Naomi Klein a long time ago. The laws of economics are like the laws of engineering. One set works everywhere. And this is how these assholes think. Unfortunately, what environmentalism did was to allow a lot of leftists to get lulled into a kind of intellectual torpor and not ask these quite fundamental questions. Because if you look at, we talked about point four developmentalism. Well, then if you look at the emergence of sustainable development as not just as a discourse, but as an actual political practice in the 1970s, it was called eco-development in the 1970s. This was fiercely opposed and critiqued from the global South. And understandably so, because eco-development, sustainable development was a project to suppress the growth and development of the global South. So again, these interplays of universalism, systems dynamics, bourgeois systems dynamics, they have the intimate political implications.
I must ask, like, when you say they were kind of, the like Western export of environmental development, eco-developmentalism were like designed to suppress the global south. Do you mean suppress from like transitioning from a kind of like transitioning to a more like developed form of capitalism, and which would necessarily be the interest of workers there, or like
it's a great question. Is very concrete, and we can sort of tease out the implications and interpretations from there. The confluence of the Trilateral Commission, which is still around, trilateral because it brought together elites from Japan, Western Europe, and North America. The Trilateral Commission, along with the Aspen Institute, which was closely aligned to the U.S. foreign policy establishment, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the CIA especially, collaborated to organize the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. It was specifically organized against the new International Economic Order project, which was a bourgeois nationalist project, but very important in the 70s, and its precursors. And they were very, very explicit. Out of this grows, for instance, the environmental NGOization of the world in the 1970s, which was, as we know, the NGO industrial project, as many people have articulated, there's a wonderful book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, but the NGO industrial complex was fundamental to the eco-industrial project, if you will, to maintain imperialist power across the South. And it turns out that eco-development was completely unnecessary in the 1980s because the imperialist debt regime zeroed out growth for Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. In any event, concretely, the imperialist club, the Club of Rome, the trilateralists, Davos emerges just before the Davos and the World Economic Forum emerged just before the Stockholm Conference in '72. These were concrete sort of political practices of organizing the Imperial North's, or the Imperial West's response to growing third world assertiveness, some of which was socialist, but most of which was not. It was simply nationalist, and as such was a clear and present danger to American dollar hegemony, its control over oil flows, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, it's an important question.
So my name is Surbi. I'm from
Surbi?
India. So I wanted to say that this logic that, in the 1970s, sustainable development was viewed with great suspicion in the global South. And even now, when people from my country, officials from my country go to COP to negotiate, they still use that logic that climate change is being used to stop our development. But on the other hand, what they are doing in our country in the name of development, it's foolishness. And people who stand up to it, people who put petitions to the Supreme Court in our country. For example, there is a mega project that is coming up in Nicobar Island, and what it will result in is that there is this tribal group called the Shompen people. 500 of them are left. They will be completely wiped out, and the government is going ahead with that project, and that entire island will be destroyed. So I just wanted to make that intervention that even 50 years later, those same logics are used and they make no sense. And the future of my country's youth is being discounted. They use this in economics, they use this term of discounting the future. That's what they're doing.
Very, very well said. So, of course, both things can be true. In the case of the climate crisis, which is quite real, that's something that a socialist politics has to take account of. And also the uses of nature as the most dangerous word, the uses of nature of natural law thinking can be used in all sorts of predatory and exploitative ways, which is the history of capitalism. And we can, you know, from there we can dig deeper into the particular uses of nature, you know, saving the environment and all of that. That there's a more often there's a different history in play, including a history of the present. And agreed on the Nicobar Islands, absolutely tragic.
Thank you.
All questions are welcome.
This is hi, I'm Gia. I'm
Hi,
based
Gia.
in Tucson, Arizona, in the United States. I just wanted to follow up on your earlier comment. I would love some recommendations for literature to look a little bit deeper into the emergence of all these international forums and commissions in response specifically to all the revolutionary movements from the global South.
Absolutely. Email me. I mean, there's a great text, and it doesn't do all of this work, but there's a great book by a historian, Paracelsus. And the tagline that I think you can remember is something like "How the United Nations Built Spaceship Earth." But it's much more interesting than that suggests. It's really, as I've a student of mine are working on an essay. It's really a story of how American imperialism built Spaceship Earth. But email me absolutely, and we can dig into it. One thing that needs to be said is that academics won't write about the history of environmentalism as a class and imperialist dynamic. There's a smattering. There are a few interventions here and there, but no respectable academic will criticize environmentalism as a tool of the 1%. And that's unfortunate because environmentalism is not just a tool, but lock, stock, and barrel a creation of the one, or as I like to say, the 0.1%. And you can dig it out, but and we'll read a little bit about this. And some people get furious at me for making this point. It's not the questions of sustainability in a broad sense are unimportant, quite the contrary. It's that, for instance, in the history of American environmentalism, if you were a farm worker, you were going to be poisoned, and environmentalists didn't care. If you were a coal miner, you were going to be sickened by black lung, and environmentalists didn't care. If you were a chemical worker in Louisiana, environmentalism wasn't going to care if your children died from cancer. Famously, Lois Gibbs of Love Canal fame in the late 1970s, who went on to build the anti-toxics movement in the United States, refused to identify herself as environmentalism. So this is an ongoing kind of empirical issue, historical, empirical, concrete question of how environmentalism, in its dominant forms, serves the powerful. So when I say dominant, I just want to blurt this out. For Marx, of course, for Marx and Engels, the method is one of identifying tendency and counter-tendency. You identify the dominant tendency, and then, of course, there are counter-tendencies that go on. Most famously, Marx does this in the theory of the rate of profit to fall. And the theory of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall includes both the tendencies that drive down the rate of profit and the counter tendencies that drive up. So a lot of times people hear me describing environmentalism in such a way. Clearly, this is the dominant tendency. That environmentalism, in its dominant tendency, is first of all concrete historical formation, and second of all is wholly a creation of the bourgeoisie, and a way of basically roping in middle class liberals. So yes, Gia, just send me an email. We'll figure it out.
So I had studied a paper on resettlement and rehabilitation, and it was around conservation projects. And that is when I really understood this point that you're making right now. So if Gia wants, I can look up the papers that my professor had recommended. Some of them might be of some help.
Yeah, conservation is a total imperialist hellscape.
Yeah. So, I mean, in India, especially, what happens is that when there is some conservation project or some village in nature reserve or whatever sanctuary, those people will be forcibly removed, and they will be promised land, money, whatever, and none of that ever happens. So that's a classic example of how environmentalism or conservation, I mean, it fails. Well, what are we doing? I mean, really.
It fails by any human standard, but it succeeds by a bourgeois standard. Yeah. And going back to the dawn of capitalism, but then reinvented through the category of nature at every great turning point in the history of capitalism, is a redefinition of the majority of humankind as savage. So in your Saraba, sorry for butchering your name, you've identified the issue perfectly, that peasants, indigenous peoples, workers, communists, Muslims, you name the population, they're redefined as savage. That is, as part of a nature that must, in nature as a ruling idea, part of a nature that must be governed, disciplined, managed, dispossessed, as you're speaking about. This is at the very core, not just of colonialism in the 16th and 17th centuries, and then ever since, but also if you look at the history of environmental conservationism and its ideological hallmark in Paul and Anne Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, published in 1968. I'm sure some of you have encountered this book, and if you look at the first pages of this text, they share the story of visiting Delhi in 1965. And it is the most kind of racist, imperialist reckoning of Delhi, that it's, poverty and filth and dirt and disease. Why? Because there were, in Ehrlich's words, too many people. They were not smart enough, not rational enough to understand how to take care of themselves. They were, in the classic formulation of imperialists, they were savages. And this is at the core of the environmentalism of the rich since the late 60s in its mature, sort of familiar form. So these are the uses of, this is what a historical materialist critique can allow us to identify, that it's not all about, issuing power at the barrel of a gun. Now, that's fundamental. And of course, the phrase is from Mao, and Mao is very sophisticated in situating this. It's a political struggle, and it's an ideological struggle. It is what Lenin called a theoretical struggle that's absolutely important to establishing the ways that, for instance, as you were talking about, the ways in which domestic capitalist forces use an opposition to environmentalism as justification for engaging in predatory and dispossession strategies. So the critique of ideology is so fundamental to everything that we're talking about. Pardon my cough here and there.
Sorry. Also,
so sometimes these abstract. Go ahead, please.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I don't know if maybe this is too anecdotal or just like, yeah, I was just thinking with the conversation you were having just right now of how like different techniques in which national capital in the South can integrate environmental how do you say it? Conservative conservatism. It's not conservatism, right?
Conservationism.
Conservationism. Thank you. how environmental conservationism can be used. I was just yesterday I was talking with this friend from Peru who is working in the southeast, close to the border with Bolivia, and he was telling me how um, there is this whole region that was proclaimed natural conservation, and the laws in the Peruvian state doesn't. One of the things that, as a consequence of declaring this place natural sanctuary or something, is that the Peruvian jurisdiction doesn't have all the implements that it would have in other parts of the territory. And that has led to a lot of indigenous population to engage in illegal mining, which then goes directly into the flows of national capital in the metropolitan area of Lima. So that is, I think that that is even somehow even more perverse than displacing people. It's just uh, again reifying them as part of nature and then making them into agents that can work somehow below the scope of the law.
Absolutely. That's very, very well said. There's a famous book that really, whose title really captures the essence of these dynamics, which is Fortress Conservation. If you're ever curious, you can go and look at an outfit, an NGO called the Earth League, like a superhero, the Earth League, which brands itself as an environmentalist consortium of former military and, wait for it, intelligence officers. And their self-assigned task is to police nature preserves, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, but not only. The Earth League's chief scientist is somebody named Johan Rockström, famous for his planetary boundaries framework. He is Germany's leading climate scientist. He's Swedish, but he moved to the Potsdam Institute. And every year, or maybe not every year, but very, very frequently goes to Davos to hobnob with the masters of the universe there. So you begin to see the profound weaponization of the idea of nature in the contemporary context, all of which is undergirded by a theory of the world, a theory of the case, as we would say in the US, that the problem is one of man versus nature. And therefore, what is necessary is the use of science to develop managerial frameworks that are allegedly outside of politics. They are, in James Ferguson's wonderful turn of phrase, an anti-politics machine. That is a technocratic face of conservationism based on the European rationality of world domination, one of my favorite phrases from Max Weber. And that's very dangerous because it suggests that the problems of the environment are problems of social management rather than problems that need to be resolved through democratization and the redistribution of wealth and power, that is, through socialism. And then you also, as you know, across Latin America, then you have a very curious line of politics and slogans that revolves around defense of life territories, which is the inverse of, and not in a good way. I mean, like it is the inverse project of this nature conservationism, and feeds into, unfortunately, tendencies towards blood and soil conservationism, nationalism, and et cetera. And a reification of, also a reification, not to mention a romanticization of the indigenous, which is very, very dangerous too. Aha, is that, have I said your name right? Or is it Aga?
It's Aga.
Oh.
It's Aga.
Aga.
It's short for Agatha.
Aga. Oh, okay, very good.
Hi. So I was just thinking, I was just basically wondering how to understand the labor of soils and how the kind of concept of conservationism then plays into it. Is that in a way a part of it? How does it kind of, could that work? I don't know.
Well, so even if you've only done a small bit of gardening in your life, you understand that your labor is mixed with the earth. This is an idea that in its bourgeois conception goes back to John Locke, but also is there in Marx in a very, very different way, that soils work, streams work. That this is not the physiocratic position that soils produce value. Soils do not produce value. And that's maybe in a socialist mode of production, soils would produce value because value is a political and class construct. So clearly, that much of, and in my life as a historian of agriculture, it's worth looking at that of course labor mobilizes. Marx has a great phrase for this: activates potentialities slumbering within nature. That's in the labor process, the first page of the labor process discussion in Capital. It's a great phrase, and that should be kept with us very intimately. Various forms of campesino to campesino agroecology practice across Latin America over recent decades have shown that cooperation is a force of production, something Marx and Engels again say in the German ideology. So that's a very different approach. Look at the Cuban model after the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991. The understanding that they would shift dramatically towards agroecology through and also to integrated pest management and other forms. IPM is not the same as agroecology, I know. But to an understanding that in order to advance the productive forces in agriculture, you would have to move to a very different model than agricultural conservationism and all of that. In the United States, modern conservationism emerges in a domestic form. It was also, conservationism was also a project of, say, the British Empire, both of which really take off after World War II. In the United States, it was through people like Aldo Leopold, how to think like a mountain, Sand County Almanac. Leopold was, and famously game management, Leopold was a managerial thinker. And ferociously anti-labor, by the way. So that conservationism in this bourgeois guise became a mechanism for abstracting labor and then finding ways to control, in a thoroughly bourgeois capitalist sense, to control parcels of the web of life in order to advance productivity. A very different, a kind of capitalist Promethean approach to agriculture, which was not new by any stretch of the imagination, but enters into a new phase after World War II with the real blossoming of what we came to call the Green Revolution, which began in the United States then. Christine, let's get your thoughts and voice in here.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, no, I was really interested in when you mentioned about labor and soil, because I'm in Indonesia right now, and a lot of flood and a lot of disasters are happening here. And in the fight and advocacy towards the main problems that made a lot of disaster possible are the imperialist mindsets, the capital accumulations that are happening across all of the forests. And ADAP, or the customary communities, are the frontliners most of the time. But coming from a cultural worker myself, I was thinking about these labors that are considered invisible. I don't know if that's the correct term, or the type of discourse that are happening in the class. I'm quite new with these ideas, and how do we really, I don't know if it's maybe direct me in the readings how I can navigate to figure out the invisible labors, the care, or the ethics, and maybe and I'm navigating archipelagic thinking here in the agrarian studies. So maybe you can like point out which specific directions that I might be able to find answers in our readings.
Well, yes, absolutely. And you can email me for more specifics. However, the critique of invisible labor was really pioneered by feminist Marxists and even liberal feminists. Most famously, there's a wonderful book by Marilyn Waring called If Women Counted. And central to my argument in Capitalism in the Web of Life and to the world ecology conversation that is issued from it is the centrality of unpaid work. And that's not only human unpaid work, but also extra-human unpaid work, as we've been talking about. They're dialectically joined to class formation under capitalism, not just proletarianization, but bourgeoisification. That capitalism really works by appropriating via extra economic procedures, political, cultural, juridical procedures, the unpaid work of humans and the rest of the web of life. That's why capitalism is basically over at this point. That those frontiers of unpaid work, of invisible work, exactly the right phrase to use, I would say, have come to an end insofar as the appropriation of that unpaid work is sufficient to allow for a new phase of capitalism. That is, to allow for a new phase where the rate of profit would rise, and that investment would recommence. Now, what we're seeing on a world scale is very different, which portends a post-capitalist mode of production. Perhaps a decadent transition, as Samir Amin would say, a revolution from above. Passive revolution is Gramsci's term, of course. But essentially, capitalism is a system of unpaid work. That's core to my argument. So your instincts, Christine, are exactly in the right direction, and we will dive into this very in our next session. So let's keep thinking in all the right ways. Hugh, and did I see anyone else? All right, Hugh, go for it.
I wanted to circle back to something that you were talking about, which had also struck me in the assigned reading from the week. It was a note that I had highlighted for myself. The enmeshing of labor and soil as a kind of absolute bond. I'm wondering how then from this point, labor begins with the making of tools. This sort of establishes this necessary sort of triadic braid between labor, tool, and soil. I would imagine that the tool rather allows for that kind of like intensification of the metabolic rift because it facilitates the kind of like further extraction beyond the necessity of what the tool yielder might actually need. I mean, the example of the garden that you gave, like you garden with a trowel until you garden with the backhoe, till you garden with you know what I mean? It facilitates this kind of intensification. Could you expand on the role that tools and technology play in that braid a little bit from your perspective? I'm super interested in how you might kind of juggle those.
Yeah. This is central to, of course, a small question, right? No, this is fantastic, and this is central to a number of essays that I've published over the past decade, especially especially in the capitalist scene essays. For instance, Marxists who have had a fairly unimaginative conception of the forces of production and the law of value failed to see, for instance, that the Mercator projection, the modern map, was every bit as much a decisive and epochal innovation as the steam engine, and indeed that the steam engine was not even the most significant innovation of the early, in terms of the rotary steam engine, I should be specific, of the early 19th century. The key technical innovation, the force of production that really made possible everything else was in that era was the cotton gin. It wasn't the steam engine. The steam engine only becomes useful in British industry by 1830 because of massive cheap cotton flowing into England. Not as the result of the cotton gin. The cotton gin was a key technological moment. So it's very important to sort of tease out, like we're not a determinist. But going back to this question of the soil and the appropriation of the unpaid work of soils, understood both literally but also metaphorically. When Marx says the soil and the worker, he doesn't literally mean just soil. And when he says the worker, in this, at the end of that passage on 638 of the Vintage Penguin edition, it's culminating the discussion of large-scale industry. So when he says the worker in this specific moment, it's the proletarian. Now, that matters a lot because you mentioned metabolic rift. The Foster's concept of metabolic rift doesn't have a concept of the specificity of labor. All the Marxists forgot that because, well, I don't know why. Maybe somebody can explain it better than I can. It seems to me that Foster has many useful things to say, but if you look at his conception of the specificity of labor, you can look for a long time. It's not there in the original formulations of metabolic rift, a term, by the way, that Marx doesn't use. That it would be much more, I think, helpful because in English, rift has a geological sensibility of a separation, like a rift valley or something like this. I think it would be much more pedagogically useful to go to Marx's fourfold sense of estrangement. And from there, yes, it is a metabolic process. Marx's actual phrasing is a rift in the interdependent processes of social metabolism, which is a bit different from how it's almost always used by Marxists. And it's just not a very, I'm not saying it's not a very Marxist phrase, and therefore it's not good. There can be lots of ideas that are Marxist. However, as most folks know, Bellamy Foster likes to sort of get up on his soapbox and give himself a lot of pats on the back for being the world's most orthodox Marxist. And okay, but then where's the specificity of labor and labor power in the theory of metabolic rift? Or for that matter, where is it in the theory of monopoly capitalism? Instead, what you get are these fragments. And for me, the Marxist imaginary is most useful because it is a journey of synthesis, which means we move forward and we synthesize new ideas, and that means we leave behind some of the old, and we integrate new, and we advance on that basis, not repeat the same mantras again and again. All right, we got a hand up from the news center. Who's there?
Hi,
Hey.
Brenda, we've got past like the halfway mark, so I just want to clarify if you want to take a break.
All right. Well, do people want to? We can take a break for a few minutes. Sorry, I think we got carried away, or I got carried away. Should we take 10 minutes? Yes. All right. We'll take 10 minutes, and I'll see you at 3:51 my time. So whatever 51 is in your time zone. All right.
Okay.
Are we back? I see Ronga. You have a question? Should we wait a
Yes.
moment or
Yeah, Jason.
not too long? Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Actually, I read that your book is just since 2016 until now, and then I know that some of the debate between you and Foster in the online internet somehow we try to divide it between the two on the thinking between you and also Foster. But I have one of questions about what you think about the non-human labor as well as interpretation of the Marx, which is about the species being that Marx tried to divide between the labor of humans and also bee when they're producing something. So yeah, I just try to make sure what is your answer by. Thank you, Jason.
Well, it's fantastic. Well, of course, there hasn't been a debate between Foster and I because that would involve, actually debating real positions. And one of the key
Ontologically, right?
differences, pardon?
Ontologically, the position of the ontologically. I mean, that
I don't
you.
think so. I've never seen him or any of the metabolic rift people address my ontological positions aside from calling me monist.
Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Which is complete fiction. I mean, because what they mean is a bourgeois monist, and that's complete fiction. I mean, it's like, let's have a debate. Great, let's actually debate, not hurl revolutionary sounding phrases at each other, as Marx and Engels say in the German ideology. Marx's conception of the labor process is one that mixes human labor, which is also human consciousness, with the rest of nature. And you can see that, and Marx regards the human labor process as itself a natural force, a point that he emphasizes and repeats throughout his lifetime. That doesn't mean, to your point, that doesn't mean that human consciousness and human labor is, in a different. I mean, it's in a different category, but dialectically speaking, human labor, human consciousness, human social organization only emerges through the subsequent modification of the rest of nature. And Marx is just like Marx always insists that labor is a specifically harnessed natural force. This appears in the Grundrisse, it appears in the Critique of the Gotha program, but also that he refers to webs of life as the rest of nature or external nature to remind us that we are addressing a fundamental unity. Of course, central to the Marxist imagination, the dialectical imagination, is unity in difference and difference in unity. These are, in my thinking, heuristics. They help us to understand our profound connectivity with and within the rest of life. And some of those conditions of life, like a solar cycle, is beyond what any mode of production up to now, what any mode of production could do, until there's some super mode of production that can build a Dyson sphere. That's clearly an external moment, but it's an external moment, just like the history of volcanic activity, that humans, that class formations, that modes of production have to respond. They respond to those external transformations like volcanic eruptions. They respond in a dialectical way, even if the event is not dialectical. And that means that we have a conception of work that joins the soil and the worker, and that we have a conception of class that joins the soil and the worker. Of course, not the soil in a literal way, although that too. Anyone who tries to understand the broad sweep of class society, of civilizations, of modes of production, pick your favorite concept, without understanding climate conditions, soil conditions, and how modes of production are organized through class struggle on the land. Anyone who attempts to understand modes of production without all that will have an exceedingly impoverished conception of modes of production. And if you look at what Foster does with his conception of capitalism, he goes back to Paul Ehrlich and Holdren. I forget Holdren's first name. He goes back to the IPAT formula: impact equals population times affluence times technology. You don't take my word for that. Go back to The Vulnerable Planet and look at it. It's absolutely extraordinary. He cites Sweezy and Schumpeter, but not Marx, and doesn't talk about class struggle. And so I think that's the conception here, that the class struggle is always a class struggle in the web of life. And sometimes those webs of life are virtually impossible to conceive of dialectically. However, without that conception of a difference between dialectical and non-dialectical antagonisms, we can't understand how capitalism specifically transforms some non-dialectical antagonisms into dialectical events, world historical events. Something that's quite, not only is climate change the big example, but geologists have now figured out that capitalist groundwater extraction has altered the tilt of the earth by a tiny amount, but nevertheless. So that's an example of a non-dialectical reality, the wobble of the earth, being transformed from a non-dialectical to a dialectical antagonism. Whether the dialectical antagonism becomes crucial in a given historical turning point is for us to decide. Gia.
Somewhat backing off of that response, but also this, I did raise this question in the chat before we broke for break. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on your point of metabolic rift and perhaps like discussing a little bit more Kohei Saito's. I'm sorry if I'm butchering, I'm mispronouncing.
No, that's right.
Names.
No, you
His
got it.
reinterpretation of Bellamy and also Marx, and also in relation to his proposal for degrowth.
Look, Saito has some good things to say. If Saito is a Marxist, and it's not my job to say he's a Marxist or not, it's an exceedingly unusual Marxism. It is a Marxism without history. It is a Marxism without class struggle. It is a Marxism without imperialism. And I'm not a Marxologist. But I've read enough Marx to know that Marxologists have a habit of saying, aha, look at what I've discovered in Marx. This is the Rosetta Stone to the capitalist conjuncture. So, okay, you want to argue for degrowth communism, then make the argument, which he doesn't do. I mean, this is classic utopian socialism. And utopian socialism is utopian not because it's realistic or not, but because the utopian socialists don't have an analysis of what is happening in capitalism to shape the transition to socialism. And I say socialism and not communism because Kohei Saito doesn't want to address the history of socialism, and which would involve the history of counter-revolution and imperialist death dealing. He wants to ignore that. He wants to pretend that one day we're all going to have an election and we're going to send good people to parliament or to Congress. They're going to legislate degrowth communism. And isn't it marvelous? And at the same time, whatever Saito's politics are, it's hard for me to identify Saito as a socialist. He hates actually existing socialism. And this is very common not for Bellamy Foster. He's different. He has a very sober and serious assessment of the Soviet Union. But for all of these other folks, Saito, Andreas Malm has taken the classic kind of state capitalism argument about the Soviet Union. These are people who hate actually existing socialism. They applaud every revolution except for the one that actually succeeds. And this is a big problem. So Saito, degrowth communism, okay, fine. But there's no history, there's no class, there's no imperialism, there's no sense of the extraordinary forces, extraordinary apparatus of counter-revolution and repression that has developed first and most dramatically in the United States after World War II and then globalized, as we know. And this is, I mean, either a colossal case of naivete and ignorance about the history. I mean, not just the global South. I mean, look at Europe and Operation Gladio and, the Americans' Operation Ohio. Before there was Operation Phoenix in Vietnam, there was Operation Ohio. run by the CIA in Western Germany to kill labor leaders and communists and many others after the war. So I don't know. And Saito, of course, doesn't want to debate any history. So this is you can hear my frustration coming through. Like, let's have this debate. But they don't want to debate. They want to debate categories and whether or not they use the correct categories. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's Marxism. Maybe it's a kind of Marxism. Is it useful? Does it tell us something that we didn't know already?
It seems gestural and even performative. I mean, there was one video that I saw where Saito and a group of friends collectively bought a forest that was once used for lumber production. And, the poetics about it was that this forest was abandoned, and there's like many forests abandoned everywhere once the soil's depleted, once it has no capitalist, once you cannot no longer use it for profit. And so they bought it, and it's now collectively or privately owned. And it's now open to the public, so it's like a returning back to the commons. Um, and I thought that was I'm an art educator and art historian. This is not my area of expertise, but it did seem actually kind of like a performance piece. So that's the way I was reading it, and I don't know. I just wanted to add that to the conversation that it's
and not a very good performance piece.
No, I mean there's a history the history of performance too, and land art, and which is also fraught with many. It's just fraught. I'll leave it at that. Yeah, it's not innovative at all. But anyways, I'm using that as an example to kind of point to this fact, it is tricky to place him, and it did seem like perhaps this is just the next big trend within the discourse about Marxism and ecology.
Well, eco-Marxism has always been way more eco and hardly Marxist. There are some exceptions. And I mean this in a fairly elementary sense of that definition, not in a polemical sense that, and eco-socialism especially has been way more eco than it has been socialist. So, but in terms of what we're doing today, I would say, and we'll be doing over the next few meetings, is first of all that the notion of nature and eco whatever has to be subject to a ruthless ideological critique because the ideology matters to the politics. So it's not incidental. It's not a footnote to observe that Ernst Haeckel, who gives us the word ecology, was also a co-founder of the German Monist League in the early 20th century and elaborated one version of Lebensraum before Lebensraum. I mean, the Nazis didn't invent Lebensraum. And it was always ecologized, and Haeckel was part of it. That's not incidental. It's not incidental to the story of environmentalism. When we look at somebody like James Lovelock, make of it what you will, but the Gaia hypothesis leads directly to or enables, for Lovelock specifically, a turn towards ecofascism. He gave an interview to, I don't know if it was the Tory Graph or a similar, I think it was the Telegraph, where he talks about how Britain needs to build up its navy to keep out the dark-skinned immigrants. That's pretty much a direct quote, and it's in something I wrote at some point. And this recurs again and again across the history of environmentalism. Eco-socialists won't touch this. So that's one thing they won't touch. And then they also won't touch the seemingly elementary Marxist proposition that if we're going to have a debate over theory, it's a debate that's settled on the ground of history, on the real ground of history. And that's strange. That was what surprised me about eco-socialists and their response to my work, because I thought naively, it turns out, that we would have a debate over history. This is, has been for a long time before the present, really going back to the 19th century, how Marxists dealt with major political theoretical disagreements. One of the ways they did was by going back to history. In the 1970s, the debates over imperialism and uneven development, underdevelopment were resolved, or not resolved, but addressed through the debate over the origins of capitalism, famously between Bob Brenner and Emanuel Wallerstein. And this comes up in eco-socialism, but then is not touched. It's merely asserted in terms of the Industrial Revolution, which, by the way, is a liberal concept. It's not a Marxist concept. It's a liberal concept. And these two big questions of the critique of ideology and world history are really what distinguish, you can make up your minds whether it's a good distinction or not, but distinguish world ecology from eco-socialism.
Thank you. There's a lot. There's a lot.
There's a lot.
There.
Well, we'll have more than one opportunity to come back to these questions. I'm always very, very skeptical, maybe occasionally a bit irate at socialists who hate socialism because it was imperfect. No kidding, it was imperfect. Imagine you're the Soviets. You have 2 world wars basically fought on your territory with a death toll around 38 million. No kidding, that's going to look different. Michael Parenti would always call it siege socialism, and that seems to be as good a reckoning as any. But to just dismiss all of these instances is either naive or dangerous, and I lean towards or both in the case of Saito. I mean, imagine they're playing like an American leftist would never talk about the forest history without invoking the history of American colonialism. Maybe they talk about it in terms of settler colonialism, which is not a good concept, but at least gets to the point of the power relations. Whereas, Japan, which had an actual fascist empire and practiced, actual terrible imperialism, including around forests. No, we're not even going to talk about that. All right, where do we go next?
I would like to ask a question, just kind of piggybacking off of that.
Perfect. Thanks.
If you could, do you think you could kind of, distill what's the stake, now in the politics of eco-socialism versus something like a Marxist project, which of course, in the West, there isn't a fully articulated Marxist political project, but just in how, let's say hypothetically, either side would approach 2 degrees of warming, up to 3 degrees of warming by mid-century. Because I understand the kind of epistemological, philosophical underpinnings that you're drawing out in the emphasis on labor, but so it kind of shades in a bit more. Do you think you could make this experiment for us?
So because the experiment is where are we now? 1 point something degree warming over the 1850 standard. Where isn't that right? We're 1 point.
Yeah,
somebody tell me.
I don't know exactly. Maybe someone else knows, but we're way ahead of what was projected in the Rio conference. We're way ahead of schedule, right? As far as
well, in some ways, but the world is also decarbonizing way ahead of schedule, led by China, and that's just a fact. We can interpret that however we want. That China is now past peak fossil fuel consumption and past peak CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. Even the most pessimistic major assessment of peak CO2 emissions that comes from Goldman Sachs, which says the mid 2030s. My argument about the end of cheap nature and the exhaustion of the capitalist accumulation model has rested fundamentally for about 20 years on the exhaustion of the agricultural revolution model that Marx identifies in the chapters on primitive accumulation. That is, impose market relations by the barrel of a gun, metaphorically speaking, to impose a productivity maximizing agriculture to produce more and more food with less and less labor time. That model has now definitively come to an end because of capitalogenic climate change. And I often cite in my writing and text Ortiz Bobea and her colleagues writing in the journal Nature Climate Change in 2021 that 7 years of agricultural productivity gain against a no climate change counterfactual have already been lost. But of course, climate is not the only factor. That you have the phenomena of so-called super weeds and super pests. You have political movements. There are many forces that are aligned against the expanded reproduction of the agricultural revolution model. Even the neoliberal version of that in the 70s and 80s didn't succeed on the scale of, say, the late 19th century, primarily because the frontiers of cheap land are gone. And cheap has political, ecological, geographical, a lot of different dimensions. It's not a limits to growthism. So in my view, the shift is towards a political accumulation model with very different forms coming out of Washington and Beijing, but a political accumulation model that, in fact, has been incubating for a very, very long period of time, but now seems to have reached a critical threshold. That is a shift from advancing the rate of profit to a shift of protecting the mass of profit. That's essentially a move towards what Samir Amin would call a tributary mode of production. Specifically in relation to Beijing, it looks like a new version of a very old strategy, what the great Japanese historian Hamashita called the tribute trade strategy. Belt and Road looks a lot like a retrofitted, reimagined tribute trade system that doesn't resemble the patterns of the imperial West. Meanwhile, we're seeing exactly how Washington is responding to the crisis of accumulation and seeking to, especially to entrench itself in the Western Hemisphere and to somehow hope against hope for regime change in Iran. All of these have kind of post-cheap nature strategies in play. And I think climate existential threat rhetoric is totally overblown. I think it's been weaponized to win the liberal professional classes in the imperial West to the banner of empire. And all this. I think climate change is quite real. Don't get me wrong, but like I was saying earlier, there's a difference between a climate change reality that's very real, and we're all going to die, which is something environmentalists have said for a long time for specific political reasons. They might be sincere with it. So I think that's, and I think that we're on the ongoing impasse in the 5-century accumulation model. It should be usefully paired with, even in the imperial West, the drive to install a form of sort of globalized green austerity and climate austerity. There's a reason why all of these billionaire assholes like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and George Soros, they're all, and Bill Gates, they're all neck deep in geoengineering schemes. I think there's that climate will continue to be a major issue in the world, but its politics are a bit of a funhouse mirror politics if we don't really pierce the veil of ideology and the use of nature to advance particular imperial projects. That might not be the answer you're looking for, but there's something to it.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I could say, like, I don't want to get too into the weeds on or not even into the weeds, just too niche. But the reason I asked is because I recently read Half Earth Socialism. You're probably familiar with this book.
Oh God.
I did find, I've been kind of trying to map eco-socialism, eco-Marxism a little bit, but I'm relatively new to it. But I guess because I'm trying to draw this distinction between like what I guess maybe you would say like what is to be done and what like an eco-socialist would say to the same question. And like in their case, I guess it seems like yeah, there are just non-dialectical or just laws that are inserting themselves upon us humans or like species as a whole, which means that kind of the development of like science and industry and stuff must be kind of halted, because even if those things potentially hypothetically offset can kind of be cunning toward these natural laws, still it's either not a gamble like worth making, or we're kind of past the point where like those kind of things can save us, like something like geoengineering.
Right, but they don't have any socialist politics. They don't have any socialist politics. They have it's basically a liberal argument that believes in parliamentary democracy, which hasn't existed in the imperial West for a long time, and is full. Basically, leads to authoritarian and austerity programs, which are fully consonant with the sort of Johann Rockstrom environmentalism of the rich program. Now, to make that critique doesn't say that we need to opt for Lee Phillips, air conditioners in every apartment approach. There could be a real discussion, but all of these, Afro-socialism is a great example of a classic straight-up utopianism. And not utopianism in the cool, like interesting way, but amongst other things, Troy Vatisse argues for compulsory veganism. Now, that's not whether you're vegan or not is not what matters to me in that comment, but the substituting of lifestyle politics for actual socialist politics is instructive. And adopting E.O. Wilson's just absolutely disastrous half Earth metaphor is extraordinary. If we look at the actual experiments, and that's the only thing we have to go on, the actual experiments of enclosing nature to save it, then we go back to the history of conservationism, which is a history of imperialism at gunpoint. So the political differences have to be grounded in history, only there's no history. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, it's been a while since I read Half Earth Socialism, but I couldn't find any history there. I couldn't find any history of actual either of fortress conservationism or of socialist projects. Actually, the socialist projects are much more interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think they're quite explicit about it being this kind of utopian project. Like they reference William Morris and stuff a lot, that I guess like the reason.
Well, that makes the writing easier, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like a nice world to describe at the end, but yeah, I understand your point.
I mean, yes, of course. Let's all hold hands around the campfire and sing.
Yeah, they're not Marxist.
And sing Kumbaya. I mean, not only is it not Marxist, but it explicitly plays into state of emergency politics. And these are the people who freely use language like climate emergency, forgetting. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Naomi Klein published a book called The Shock Doctrine. Maybe some of you remember this. And the whole point of the shock doctrine was that state of emergency politics are bad for working classes, and they use whatever justification is at their disposal to allow the rich and powerful to have more wealth and more power. This has been completely thrown out the window. And by the way, if we ever wanted a case of the capitalist mass media inventing reality, it's with the climate emergency discourse, which just basically comes out of nowhere and appears overnight. And what's its politics? It's basically austerity and less democracy. The Club of Rome is very, very explicit. This is so you don't have to agree with everything I'm saying here, but if you leave out what the environmentalists are actually doing, look at what the Club of Rome said in 2012. This was from Jorgen Ronders, one of the original authors of The Limits to Growth. He said, in the future, we're going to have less democracy because there's too much democracy in the the imperial West. He doesn't say imperial West, but there's too much democracy. And he leaves out something pretty crucial, that, first of all, liberal democracy was always an elitist project. And second of all, he's writing this in 2012. That is about 4 decades into the neoliberal counter-revolution of rule by decree, of emergency rule. That's the history of the United States. It's all been rule by decree over the past 50 years. And there's a pretense that, well, if only we turn up to the ballot box and we vote for the Green Party, then we can have degrowth communism, which is, I think the technical term is a fantasy. But it has no history, has no sense of politics. They're utopian, but they don't want to deal with politics, which is, it seems to me like, okay, if we want this transition, then what are the politics involved? Yeah. Sorry, I get a little fiery. I know we're near time, so Hugh, jump on in, and if there's any other questions, we'll squeeze those in too.
You may not have any experience with this text, so no worries if you don't. I've been plugging through Karatani's subject to world history recently, and working through the different modes and thinking a bit about some of the conversations we've been having today about the kind of specific localities of labor dynamics, and considering his kind of then shift from the emphasis of labor onto the modes of exchange. I mean, this is really a kind of, do you have any thoughts on sort of prompt? Because you've been sharing thoughts, so I thought I'd like kind of bookend it with that.
I mean, Karatani may be a great philosopher. I can't judge, but a friend of mine, Joel Wainwright, he said, well, you got to read Karatani. So I got it and I read it, and I'm like, well, where's the book is called, right, The Structures of World History?
Yeah, and then it has like a sub, I'm trying to remember. I don't have I'm not,
it has some
from modes of
subtitle, but
production
there's no
to modes
history.
of exchange. Yeah.
There's no history to it. Like, here's why history is so great to read, regardless of your field. You read a mediocre historical study, and you will learn something. I didn't want to say I didn't learn anything from Karatani, but I didn't learn anything about history. And this is kind of the Saito problem. It's a problem of a lot of elite intellectuals who, I guess, say they're doing theory in the trilateral zone, from the rich and powerful countries. It's theory detached from the real ground of history. So that's what I would say. If we have what we imagine to be, so if we have a theory, so Hugh, if you say no, mode of exchange is the right way, and I say mode of production is the right way, how do we deal with that? This is a big problem. How do we deal with it? Well, Marx and Engels have a specific answer. We look at the real ground of history. Yeah. Right. Not in an empiricist or naive way, but even an empiricist approach to history is better than no approach to history. And so I can say, well, here I want to tell you the usefulness of the categories of surplus labor and mode of production in late medieval Europe, and I get, why did feudalism enter into crisis, and ultimately, in some parts of Europe, lead to the emergence of capitalism. That's an actual historical problem, and you could say, well, what about this? And I could say, what about that? Empirically, right? And you don't have to be like, a history nerd to have these conversations. We can simply recognize, right, well, I don't know. Like, does capitalism really begin in England? No, it doesn't. Not even Bob Brenner thinks it does. Marx certainly doesn't think it does. But we can get into the empirics of it, and well, does that empirical assessment mean that it is a transition to capitalism? We can do the same around socialism. Well, as I like to say, I'm a very practical person. Like, you take the good with the bad. Like, if all you know about, maybe all of you think the United States was always horrible, but if all you know about the United States is, I don't know, the history of slavery, then you're going to say, okay, yeah, then it was terrible through and through. But then if you look at various class struggles, labor struggles, indigenous struggles, you might say, well, there are contradictions in the social formation. That's an actual kind of, like, you don't have to be a Marxist to buy into that, right? You could be whatever. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I'm with Marx most, like if that's Marxism, I'm not a Marxist. I don't think that Marxists have any special monopoly on wisdom here. But if we're taking Marx and Engels seriously, then yeah, let's look at, what actually happened, which could be 5 seconds or 5 minutes or 500 years ago. That, there's the sense of this is, a phrase that's been uttered in different versions by Lukács and Paul Sweezy. How do we see the present as a world historical moment? And then we can get somewhere. And I think why you hear me a little bit agitated when I talk about these other eco-socialists is that they don't want to do this, with a partial exception of Bellamy Foster here and there, who will dabble in a little bit of history about the Soviet Union or the guano trade in the 19th century or this or that. Then there's actually a debate that we could have, not that he wants to have that debate. And that's a tragedy. I mean, in the proper sense of that term, that's a tragedy if Marxists are not willing to have debates over history. I would rather have debates with a liberal, as long as well, maybe I'll learn something, maybe I'll see it differently as opposed to, let's study the categories and, you have to get them right. Like, oh, so-and-so used this phrase like twice. And then that means that he's, a social constructionist and a neoliberal and all these things. That's just silly. I mean, that's, and going back to, I think, Nick, your question, I think the way that we need to respond is to actually have serious debates. And all those, and not just denounce each other, right? And have these conversations. And oh yeah, if you're going to talk about existential threat, maybe you can talk about the imperialist drive towards nuclear war. Which I haven't. I'm sure there are eco-socialists who talk about this. Maybe my comrade Jason Hickel is one of the exceptions, and there are a few others. But these issues are really separated. I say this all the time about the Anthropocene discourse. 20 years of the Anthropocene literature, including by Marxists, and not a single word, as near as I could tell, maybe a single word somewhere, about about American forever wars. Right? I mean, that's insane. And that shows you the power of ideology. All right, I think that we are at time. And I think that the moderators will help you figure out the group work. Thanks, Hugh. Thanks, everyone. The discussion was really, really great. And next time, hopefully, we'll get more. We had a lot of voices in here, and we'll get more. I set up a sign-up sheet for texts with two sign-up slots for each sort of grouping of texts. And not all texts are covered because we can dig into them a little more. But you can go and sign up and coordinate from there. If we end up with more than 12, there are 12 slots and I think 12 students. But if my math is wrong, you can add a third slot to one of them. You can adjust those however you want. And can I ask the moderators, do you need more from me right now?
No, not quite. So just as long as it's clear about the group, but I will communicate with everyone over the course of this week to clarify. Okay. And as always, and some of you had questions about specific texts, just shoot me an email. If you can, and I send reply to my personal Gmail, because I'm just not going to be responding very quickly. But I will check my News Center Gmail on a couple of times during the week. So if it's not urgent, it doesn't matter. But if you want a response more in a more expedited way, just email me directly. I'm pretty mellow about these things. So if questions come up, or you want to write a note saying, Jason, you're wrong about everything, you could be nice, but you could do that. That's totally allowed. All right. And I look forward to talking with all of you next Saturday. All right. Take care, everyone. We'll see you soon. We'll be in touch. This was fun.